Eden Cause here would just be spiritual boom, gently moving you into being and seeing more. And from this point on, we're going to stop being so gentle. I have decided, starting with this episode, that I'm going to start interviewing people who can really bring more awakening to this process. So guests and that are outside of my client base. So people who know stuff. And one of those people, and he will be my first, is Saul Luckman, who is in Florida. And I'm just going to talk about him for just a second before we officially greet. He writes, and Saul, I'd like you to comment to this, if you will. He paints, he speaks. I would consider him an academic. He went through a major health crisis, and because of that, I'm sensing he is now an energetic healer. And hopefully we can talk a little bit about codes, which led him to DNA regenetics. And he stated in one of his podcasts, which I loved, which is the same as me, his goal is to present information and let people make up their own mind. So potentially today in our conversation, I want to know about Saul's awakening process to everything that's going on in the world, as well as potentially discussing matriarchy, the goddess, and our simulated world. So to get us started, I want to ask you this first question. Do you ever sleep? Because you're very busy from what I can see.
Oh yeah, well, thanks for having me. I do sleep, yes, and I have fun and I chill out and do all those types of things. So I'm normal in those ways. I like to stay busy, but I don't like to work long hours. I like to work and then take a break and then work and take a break. But very often I find myself doing stuff even later at night.
Okay.
Um, so because I'm not just plowing through a work day.
Yes. So thank you again so much for being here. What would you like to talk about today?
Oh goodness. I mean, I like the topics that you mentioned. I've been on this major simulation theory soapbox lately, and that's been fascinating to me. And wicking all of that information into various conversations about the goddess and matriarchy and archons and who's actually controlling our world, and
Yes.
also manifestation principles, how we can actually move around a little bit more like Neo in the Matrix, as opposed to someone who's plugged in all the way. I think that's a very important discussion, an ongoing discussion that people need to be having.
Well, let me obviously first ask you, how did you come to become aware that there was so much to this world than meets the eye? What was your awakening process, or has it been a gradual process? Or yeah, tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I know you went through your own illness, and that, for a lot of people, that's the wake up call. You go through thinking through a lot of your life thinking that you're invulnerable and pervious and immortal. And for me, I got really, really sick after getting some jabs when I was headed down to South America for dissertation research.
Mm-hmm.
And so I ended up having a kind of lost decade of autoimmunity where I had something, a lot of people would think of it as something along the lines of fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, that kind of thing, with
Right.
really awful food allergies and sensitivities and that kind of thing. So that was a huge wake up call for me, that I wasn't what I thought I was, and then I wasn't helped by the things that I thought would help me, like allopathic medicine. So, that was another major wake up where I was left to my own devices, which included a kind of wanderhar into the alternative medicine world and energy healing. And most of it totally unsuccessful. I just wasn't helped by much of anything. There were a couple of things that helped me that were of an energetic nature, and that's what really clued me into the power of energy. One of them was Qigong, that helped me restore some of my energy. It didn't cure me or anything like that.
Right.
And then allergy elimination technique was another piece of the puzzle, which really opened my eyes to the power of very simple, energetic, non-invasive interventions to change a lot of health outcomes like allergies and that sort of thing. So that was the stage that was set for me to go into a much deeper dive into the relationship between sound and DNA and our kind of multi-dimensional aspect, and eventually even into ideas having to do with this notion that we're not living in a real world at the moment, and that may be why we have such magical abilities that seem so like so much like programming or breaking programs or hacking the system, whatever you want to call it.
So before that happened to you, were you religious or spiritual in any way?
I was a student of life, and I was
Okay.
really into, into experiencing things fully. I was spiritual in the way that like Jack Kerouac might be spiritual, or
Okay.
somebody like that. And very much embracing life, embracing, being alive and experiencing lots of different things. But I wasn't, deeply spiritual. I was quite artistic, but I was definitely more mainstream in a lot of my thinking. And even though I believed in, you know, I believed in things like spirit, but it didn't play a massive role in my life. I was raised in a I was raised in a Southern Baptist culture, and I spent a little time dipping my toe in those waters. But my immediate family wasn't particularly religious, so there was never any pressure on me to be a Christian or anything like that. So that didn't last very long for me, maybe a few years, and it was mostly a social thing when I
Mhm.
was in middle school and high school, because our church had a really nice youth group and choir, and I enjoyed some of the activities and the people.
So did you grow up in Florida? Because I'm from originally from Georgia.
Right. No, I grew up in North Carolina.
Oh, North Carolina. Okay. Yeah, because I get the Southern Baptist part because I grew up with a lot of that as well. Hmm.
Mm-hmm. Although there's, a good bit of that in Florida for that matter.
Okay. So when this health challenge came your way, and you said it was like a decade of getting through that, did you get deeper, would you say, each year? Or how did it progress? If that's an if I worded that correctly.
I mean, from a spiritual standpoint or the health,
Yeah, a spiritual standpoint.
um, yeah, I mean, I definitely learned a lot each year as I explored different modalities and tried to figure out what they were trying to do. And then, of course, when I started learning Qigong, that was this kind of meditational
Mhm.
precursor to Tai Chi, right? And so
Right.
it's really that's where I got exposed to a lot of Eastern thinking. Had a really, really great teacher, learned a lot about spirituality. It's such a funny word. I don't even know what it means in some ways anymore, but I began thinking outside the box of materialism, let's put it that way, more and more with
Yes.
each month and year.
So for me specifically, everything that's going on in our world right now, like I tout this, really for myself has nothing to do with Republican, liberal, conservative, any of these labels. It's all just, to me, very spiritually based. This probably leads well into the matrix, because I also believe here on this planet that it is a stage, that it is just a training ground, that as souls we come here to learn and to evolve. How would you take that further? What would you say?
Yeah, I think I mean, a lot of people are at least open to looking at that. Certainly, we have a lot of academicians and scientists looking at the idea that we might be living in some kind of simulation. And there was just an article I read recently
Mhm.
by someone who calls himself a cosmologist, and
Yes.
this was Geraint Lewis. He's a professor of astrophysics at the University of Sydney, and he wrote this article on theconversation.com called "Alert: You May Be Living in a Simulated Universe." And so they're looking at data. A lot of these people are looking at data that does not look organic, meaning it's patterned too perfectly.
Yes.
And you have other people looking at weird periodicities in history where the same phenomena repeat and repeat and repeat, and they do it. This happens at exactly the same intervals.
Mm-hmm.
There's not even a little bit of variation in it. And this all screams artificiality, that we're not living in an organic, natural world where things happen, even if there are rhythms and patterns, like, spirals. That's a huge part of our world. But really, even if you look at nautilus shells and that kind of thing, there are little differences and discrepancies. They're not all the same.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the illusion of kind of this natural quality of the world. But really, when you look down, when you look deeper into the bedrock, what I would consider to be the kind of programming level, it all just appears to be like it's some kind of coding. And our best analogy would be like a computer code, like something in the matrix.
Mm-hmm.
But it could be something way, way beyond anything we've ever been exposed to. I mean, you're talking potentially technology that might even have organic components to it. I think of something like Avatar, where they have this huge technology that's actually a tree, right, and that they connect with, that's there, that has their memories contained in it, that they can connect to, like they're connecting to some kind of mainframe or something. So who knows what the nature of this technology is, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that it could be vastly superior to what we have, and you could be jacked in via your nervous system, and everything you experience would seem absolutely real. All of the pain, all of the highs and lows would be very, very real. And that would be the purpose of the simulation, in my estimation, because if we knew that it wasn't real, we would not learn certain things.
Right.
And and also, learning that it's not real is a step of the learning process and the acquisition of wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a necessary step to go through. You have to sort of start out thinking it's real, and then you realize that it's not. And then, boy, that is a can of worms, because it opens up a massive series of questions. And one of the questions that people seem to immediately come back with, and this is when it triggers people, is they're like, well, then what's the point? It's just meaningless, right?
Right.
We're just
Yeah.
living in some kind of simulation. And I think that's really shallow. And my catchphrase that I come back to over and over again is, I doubt very seriously that fighter pilots doing simulations would think they're meaningless.
That's a great analogy. So when you talk to people about this, knowing that you probably discuss this a lot with people who are more awakened, let's put it that way. For folks, this is kind of a new concept. What do they generally, how do they react?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really discuss it on an interpersonal level that much. I mean, I mentioned this in interviews and online and that kind of thing, but mostly I just put out my perspective and my learning on this topic. What I come across and what I'm able to share. And yes, people do have reactions to that. A lot of people who are attracted to my work are not. This is not shocking to them.
Right.
They're already there.
Yeah.
And and these are not typically people who just watched The Matrix one day and said, "Hey, maybe we're living in a simulation." No, these are people who have taken their own deep dives into the material, and they realize that there's some there, that there's something going on with this idea of simulation theory.
Okay, let me ask you this. For folks that are just waking up and starting to delve more down the rabbit hole, are there things that you would suggest them looking at? Or yeah, I guess that's a good question. Where would you point them?
Yeah, well, I would recommend that people stay tuned into my Substack, because I'm doing a lot of this type of work on that venue. That's saulluckman.substack.com.
I'll
And
include that.
I'm putting my own podcasts out. I'm interviewing people. I'm sharing, a lot of related material, tonight I have a podcast airing at 8 p.m., which is simulation theory, Gnostic writing, and sound healing, right? That's with Typical Skeptic. I just interviewed Jason Brashears of Archaics, who's amazing, and you can see information, links over to his world also on my blog. I published an article just the other day called Embryonic Holography, and it's all about how DNA and genetics work holographically, and so that's just a hop, skip, and a jump from the idea that it's all simulated, it's all energy waves, frequencies, quantum phenomena, that sort of thing. So, you can come at this from a lot of different levels. You can do it, you can look at the history, you can look at science, and you can look at the history of digital technology and that kind of thing, and you can look at it more poetically, cinematically. You can really approach the simulation topic from a lot of perspectives.
Interesting. All right, can we just I guess move into, but knowing that we don't have to leave this completely, talking about the goddess and the matriarchy, because I've discussed multiple times about how all of this is about the divine feminine waking up, becoming more, I guess, powerful is the word, but also this balance of divine feminine and masculine. What would you add to that, Saul?
Yeah, interesting. I wrote a novel last year called Callie the Destroyer, that's about a girl named Callie in a dystopian futuristic society who ends up embodying the goddess. And literally the eon from Gnosticism, the goddess Sophia, or Gaia Sophia, that some people call her, literally comes into her body. And her mate is also embodied. Thelete is in the Gnostic tradition. Thelete is Sophia's consort, and he is also a god. So these two divine beings end up incarnating. So the book is both about it's about simultaneously about the divine feminine and the divine masculine, but it's also about the relationship between those as archetypes. So you could look at it as a kind of twin flame story as well, a cause of an absolutely massive cosmic, on a massive scale, I should say. So I've really thought a lot about this, and I looked at the feminine from the perspective in that book of someone like John Lash, who wrote a very fascinating book on Gnosticism 15, 16 years ago now, called Not in His Image. I highly recommend that book. And he details what he calls the fallen goddess scenario, which is this idea that that he basically kind of mined out of the Gnostic material when he retranslated it for himself. And it's this idea that Sophia was living in the center of the galaxy. She created humans. She fell out of the galaxy when she was dreaming about what it would be like to watch her creation begin to have experiences. And she really freaked out as she was falling through space, and ended up inadvertently creating a race of semi-organic beings called archons, right?
Okay.
And so then she became the planet that we live on, and we end up having to kind of pick up the pieces relative to the archons, who are very jealous of us and very angry with their mother. And those are our kind of extraterrestrial controllers. They're like these mind parasites that control the world. And so it's very interesting to look at it from that perspective. And there are many other ways you could look at the scenario, however, that don't really have to do with the idea of some kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Some kind of organic life form. Like if you're in a simulation, the archons could be programs.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, they're referred to in the Gnostic writings as the lords of time, and they appear to distort time. It's one of the ways they control us psychically or mentally. So that's very interesting. In that scenario, like I went into with Rob of Typical Skeptic, you have this possibility that the goddess is not really our mother in that sense, but she's more like the motherboard
Okay.
that out of which the simulation is projected. If you think about the Matrix movie, you have the divine archetypes of the feminine and masculine. You have the architect who is like God,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have the oracle who is like the goddess.
Right.
She also has a role inside the functioning of the matrix. And there, well, I say inside, but she and the architect appear to be beings that live almost on the cusp of reality because they were somehow very much involved in the creation of the matrix itself.
Mm-hmm.
So they may be aspects of reality intruding into the simulation.
And again, it's so neat to talk to you because there's so many different perspectives on the world and flat earth and oh my gosh, and there's so many conspiracy theories right now that are so ripe. I did an episode just listing some of them off, and then I did another episode because oh my gosh, there's so many right now. And I also talk about when something is called a conspiracy theory, that probably means that there's a lot of truth to that. And when there are fact checkers, that is another indication that you need to look more deeply into this. Do you believe or feel that, again, it's really challenging to talk about history as well, knowing that everything is quantum, and I believe that everything is happening simultaneously, yet we'll just say history because it's easier to say it that way. Do you think that there have been times in history where there have been periods where women, the feminine was more dominant because we're led to believe that we've always had a heavily patriarchal society?
If you go to saulluckman.substack.com,
Yes.
there's an article I published on September 29th called "The Goddess Was First," and
Oh,
it is a video it's a couple videos. It's
okay.
one of my interviews that I pair with a short video, 15-20 minutes, by Jason Brashears of Archaics, and he's looking at the history of the world. He's written a number of books, including an unpublished book that he calls his Chronicon,
Hmm.
which is a history of the world. And he's read something like 1,300 books that go into this research.
Hmm.
It's a fascinating life. It's absolutely amazing, and his knowledge of history dwarfs anything I've ever encountered. I never even had Ivy League professors who had read as much in their fields as he's read in his, and he was a convict for 27 years.
Wow. So interesting.
Absolutely. So he just spent all of his time reading, and he started out trying to prove the history of the Old Testament, the Bible, specifically, I think the Old Testament, and it ended up basically disproving it in most ways.
Hmm.
And what he did is he put together a history of the world. And one of the really important aspects of the history of this world is that there was a period in time far back in the BC era, but not more than 6,000 years ago,
Hmm.
when the world was fundamentally different from what it is today because we lived under a firmament. And that's a
Hmm.
biblical term. And what that basically means is that you have an ocean in the sky as well as one on the land
Okay.
that's suspended above us. It changes. Everything would have been different under this vapor canopy, as it's also called. The atmosphere would have been different. The people would have been larger. The fauna and flora would have been larger.
Yes.
The light was different. Everything was absolutely different. So that's why we have all of these legends of titans and giants and all that, because
Yes.
that's what was happening under the vapor canopy. And under the vapor canopy, prior to the arrival of the people who were later called by the Sumerians, they were called the Anunnaki, but that was a pejorative. Their actual name was the Anuna. The Anuna were these very technologically advanced people from the West.
Hmm.
and they came into the eastern part of the world, or the Middle Eastern and eastern part of the world, and encountered the goddess culture.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a struggle there, and the patriarchy fought the matriarchy and won.
Okay.
All right. So then we began the patriarchy, and that's kind of the
Okay.
beginning of the biblical story, essentially.
Uh,
Cain beget, blah,
got
blah,
it.
that's the patriarchy.
Okay.
So there was absolutely a time when the world was ruled by women, but that there's evidence that at that time men were their slaves. They were their
Mm-hmm.
actual household slaves, and they were their sex slaves. So it's not a pretty picture exactly. I mean, you
Yes.
can't think this was like better than what we have now in some
Right.
ways.
Exactly. It sounds like the same thing,
Both
but just
both
different.
both ways of doing things
Right.
are problematic
Yes.
because they're not balanced.
Exactly. Do you think we'll get back to that balanced state?
Boy, no, I don't. Not really. I
How
think
come?
I
Because
think
I do.
Well, I don't think we have that much longer to go in this simulation. I think this whole thing ends in the year 2178. So unless we get to it before then, no, it's not going to happen, in my opinion.
Okay.
But what should happen and can happen is that individuals can achieve that balance within themselves, and they
Mhm.
can use it to do absolutely extraordinary things.
Okay. How balanced do you feel that you are? Aha.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's often remarked of me by people who get to know me that I have a very pronounced feminine side. I'm not gay or anything like that, but
Yeah.
I'm comfortable with my feminine aspect, which I
Yes.
see as a kind of archetype that I'm attempting to embody in some sense. I'm really not a proponent of transgenderism kind of unleashed on society the way it's been and that sort of
Mhm.
thing. I'm all about choice to some degree, but we would have to have a very nuanced conversation about how that applies to, let's say, children.
Mhm.
And in any case, what I'm talking about has nothing to do with sex. It has to
Right.
do with a kind of balance of energies.
Yes.
Even even in, like, uh, Vedic tradition, you have the central pole, right? The
Mhm.
Sushumna, and then you have the Ida and the Pingala circling around it like a caduceus. And that's the energy that we're trying to replicate throughout our being, is this balanced, trinitized energy where
Mhm.
we have a central focus and power that comes about, in some sense, through the merger of two complementary energetics.
Mhm.
And we're calling those masculine and feminine, but you
Mhm.
could look at them as yin and yang or whatever, yang and
Yeah.
yin.
Okay. Let me see. Okay. Let me ask you this, and we because I'm watching the time as well. All right. This may be a closing question, but let's say I wanted to ask you, what would you advise people in terms of? So I'll finish this with the meditation separately in a second. So one of my big things is, oh my gosh, there's a lot going on in the world right now, and fear is being propagated on every level. So the intention of this podcast is also stay grounded, stay grounded. what
Mhm.
what would you suggest to people in terms of just, and no talking about it like everything is also stimulated or simulated? What would you suggest?
I make this point in this book I'm about to publish in January, called Musings from a Small Island, and it's basically, when you listen to the news, to the mainstream, and even to some extent the alternative media, just turn it around about 95%.
Okay, what do you mean by
So
that?
go about 180 degrees, 175 degrees away from it. It's
Okay.
almost always exactly the opposite of what's going to happen, or what actually ends up happening. So if they are talking famine, economic crash, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it's probably going to be close to the opposite of that. It's going to be some kind of rebirth of nationalism and abundance. And then if we follow the cycles that always seem to happen, that will go too far, and we will have left the, the liberal wackos of cancel culture behind, and we will have entered the Christian Reich. So we're going to just swing back in some difficult direction. But I think before we get there, we will have a period of abundance and we'll feel like we can breathe again after the last couple of years of madness during this whole episode we went through. So there are lots of things we can do individually to navigate this territory and not be affected by those currents. And the short answer to your question is follow your bliss. When you do that, Joseph Campbell said it best. When you do that, you are on the hero's journey. And because you are getting into the most powerful energy you can put yourself in for creativity and experience and adventure. And if you will stay there and commit to staying there, miracles will happen in your life.
I talk about too staying loyal to the truth. And I believe that so much of this is also us getting back to our heart center. And, I talk about moving from the 3-dimensional world, where I believe that we're kind of in the lower 4th dimension right now, moving into the 5th dimension. What do you think about dimensions?
Oh gosh, I keep referencing my books because I want to give people places where they can go learn more about this. If you read my book, Potentiate Your DNA or Snooze, A Story of Awakening, you'll learn a lot about what's called reciprocal system of physical theory, which is this idea that we live in a kind of unified field where we're in something like space-time. That's what the Dewey Larson would have called it. But there is a level of blueprints or energy that exists. This level exists parallel to us, and it's a kind of inverse reality, and that would be called time-space. So there is an energetic realm that's giving rise to the physical realm, and then the physical realm is kind of giving rise to the energetic realm. You can also take that into simulation theory and say that we're living in maybe space-time, and time-space is what's outside of us, the realm of blueprints, the realm of programming. So it actually works in simulation theory or in a quote-unquote real world. You could look at it the same way, basically. In terms of the higher dimensions, I've entertained the idea of densities and that kind of thing for a long time. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, in a simulated environment, I think it's all just kind of intellectual masturbation, and none of it's real.
Well, there you go. I'm going to include links to your websites and everything. Is there anything that you would like to close this out with?
Oh, goodness. I am releasing something cool if I can figure out how to do it on Substack. I'm having some technical difficulties, but I'm about to release a video, which will be for people who go behind the paywall, and it's called How to Potentiate Your DNA. And it's a companion to Potentiate Your DNA, and it can be used with it, but it can also be used independently to teach you how to basically potentiate your energetic self in a 30-minute session. It's very, very cool. It's using sound and vowels to do that.
That sounds incredible. So, I'm all about energy and all things, the same thing, sounds, down to the energy of your thoughts, down to the energy of, like, I'm very not careful of my words, but very aware of my words. And a lot of times I will stop and think about what I'm about to say too, because I know that just saying those things creates action. And that's kind of what awareness on every level is as well. Hey, where are you in Florida?
St. Augustine.
Okay. And you told me that you guys y'all are okay. Is that an appropriate way to say it?
Yeah. I mean, we had a little bit of fallout, but nothing like what they got in some of the other areas, like, Sarasota, Fort Myers, and Tampa. They got really slammed.
Oh my gosh. Okay. And also thinking, Florida is what do you call it? Just y'all are a bright, shiny state. And of course, the weather happening to the state at this time does not surprise me as well. So much love out to you guys as well. And so I'm so appreciative of you really being my first guests like this. So I thank you so much for chatting with me and knowing that I couldn't get my microphone to work. So hopefully I'm coming across okay, and knowing that Saul's microphone was fine. Hey, thank you so much. I so greatly appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me. It was fun. I hope I didn't, blow your listeners too much out of the water with new stuff. But sometimes trial by fire and jumping in the deep end aren't bad things.
No, they're not. And again, anything that just helps people to think more, I think is so great. So thank you so much for doing that.
My pleasure.
Okay. Over and out, man. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.